Bryan,
Hey man, technology worked finally.
it actually works. I won't make a smart ass comment about our place of work. I'm going to be a good boy.
A wise choice, my man.
It is a
How are
wise
you?
choice. How are you, man?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Good. Well, thank you so much for being here. Hello, everybody. This is the latest Trees Talk. I'm really honored to have as my guest Bryan Cantley, a colleague, and I absolutely consider him a good friend. But you know, I don't necessarily have a scripted set of questions, but I do have quite a lot of questions for you. So I hope you're okay with that. But I
I'll do
will
my
say one
best.
thing about you, Bryan. When I was in my 5-year depression and not making work, and I think you knew a little bit about that, your example of somebody who just doggedly keeps going and making work was actually quite inspirational to me, even though I wasn't making work and I couldn't do it. Aside from thinking your work is really, I mean, your work is extremely interesting to me, and I continue to be a big fan, as you know. I'm really interested in your ability to really, and I don't know how else to put it, just keep cranking it out. I mean, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, by the way. So, I mean, it was a helpful example to me, and it continues to be. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you.
I love hanging out with you as always,
Of
and
course.
thank you for the kind words about the work. It's reflected back at you, as you know. Um, interestingly enough, I think my making work is my therapy.
It's a lot cheaper than mine, man. I'll tell you that.
I don't know. It ends up costing quite a bit at the
I
end
know.
of
I'm
the day,
kidding, man.
I've kind of defined myself as a shark. I think when I stop moving, or things start shutting down for me,
Yeah.
my other senses become quite dulled in the process, if that makes any sense.
Totally.
I've always been a scavenger. I've always been an inventor, and I've always been a maker. Not necessarily of quality or good things, but there's something about, for me personally, being heavily involved and observant in the process and the act of making, that is a learning experience for me.
Yeah.
And although I certainly appreciate my downtimes, even my downtimes are I'm going to say plagued by the thought process of thinking compositionally and formally and conceptually, however you might want to label that. So I really don't see it as an option not to.
Yeah. You
I mean,
need a vacation from your vacation, Bryan.
Absolutely.
No.
Absolutely.
Well, so I mean, again, I mean, that makes total sense. I don't know if I'm built that way exactly, which is, I think it's very interesting how different artists have different processes, and that we could talk about that. But I guess one thing I mean, I don't know how this seems to be happening. It seems that almost every guest that I have on, and then again, this is never planned, but there really seems to be a theme of people who are really have cross-disciplinary interests. And I mean, I think a lot of people who are tuning in now probably know you and know your work, but for those who don't, I mean, you are trained highly trained as a traditional architect or landscape architect, right? I mean, but
An
your
architect,
practice,
yeah.
yeah, but your practice as a collage artist, as a drafts person, I mean, I'm kind of amazed that you're able to inhabit so many different platforms at really an equally high level, three-dimensional. I mean, your sculptures are I mean, I don't have any place for them, but I would buy one if I had a place and money. So I'm curious if the multidisciplinary practice is something that you planned on originally, or if you grew into that, and how that evolved. It would be quite interesting to me, I think, and a number of other people, I bet.
Yes, that's an interesting question. It's definitely not something that was planned or strategized. I think it's an aggregation of how I was raised and what I was exposed to and interested in early.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in North Carolina and did my
Right.
undergrad in North Carolina. But I've been, it's interesting. I've been interested in quite a few different, I guess, disciplines during my life. Heavily into music,
Yeah,
both as a
you're a shredding drummer, from what I mean, right?
well, I like to tell my favorite joke. What do you call the guy that likes to hang out with a bunch of musicians?
The
The drummer.
drummer.
Yeah, and that's all understood. And
That's not true, dude. Come on.
well, so I mean, music as both a consumer and a producer and a studier of.
Yeah,
I was, I mean, growing up in North Carolina, one had to play basketball, so heavily into the playing and the consumption of basketball and basketball culture.
yeah. Are you
Um,
still interested in it?
Still interested in it.
Yeah, I love it.
My knees and my hip are to the point where I couldn't play a pickup game if you paid me. Um, but definitely interested. I'm really interested in the mechanics and the poetics and the timing,
Yeah,
and even, and you'll probably appreciate this, the way that the graphics of the court and the
yeah,
game worked into the dissemination of the information on a screen, which is how I watched it, you know, as a
right.
child.
Yeah.
And then I've also been a martial artist all my life, and
I didn't know that, Brian.
oh
Really?
well,
How did
yeah,
I not know that? What
a
discipline? What disciplines do you practice?
well, again, I've studied Taekwondo,
Yeah,
Aikido, Kung Fu. I'm still currently a student of Tai Chi and Qigong.
yeah.
Um, uh, and I've always been interested in kind of bouncing around and never sort of staying in one place. And I think
Hmm.
interest in body mechanics and movement and interaction, especially, in fact, I was having this conversation with Kim last night, the difference in traditionally in Japanese versus Chinese martial arts. You know, Japanese tend to be linear and
Uh-huh.
Chinese tend to be circular.
I see.
And I discovered this martial art, Hwarangdo, when I was in grad school at UCLA, which is interesting because it's both a linear and a curvilinear system. And I think for me, that kind of explains why this cross-disciplinary, multi-referential environment exists, is that I think in order to be the best architect or artist or musician or martial artist, you have to, or person, shall we say, if we
Yeah,
know what
yeah.
that is, we have to pull from all aspects. And I don't really like classifications and groupings in any part of my life. I hate being part of a specific group because that means I have to behave the way the group dynamics say that I have to
I
behave.
think we share that, Brian.
100%, man, 100%. So I think that's reflective in how I look at, in how I absorb and look and produce work. That it's, although
Hmm.
it might be singular in its current voice, hopefully it's not singular in its interest or its reach and its output.
Do you think it's singular in its voice though? I wouldn't agree with that at
Well,
all.
I mean, you could, I think, boil it down to us. I get asked this question a lot when I do lectures. You know, in terms of stylistic
Okay,
concerns,
I see.
it is somewhat singular. And
I would use. I mean, I'm not trying to argue with you, Brian, but maybe I am. I would use the word recognizable, not singular, because I mean, I don't know. We can talk about it. I mean, obviously, the artist has a harder time putting themselves in a category that is objective, right?
right,
I mean, I mean, I see your work as actually being multiplicitous in its ability to talk about A, different media, but B, I mean, I really think that you really, I don't think I can think of a single other artist I could say this about. Really, now that I think about it, you are able to make work that really has a theoretical backdrop in some ways, in many ways, but it's also really, this is going to sound, I don't mean this in a good or bad way, it's strangely personal looking too. And it's not because you're dealing with personal content necessarily, although maybe you are. It's because you have such a distinctive way of making things that the style and the look of it, no matter what the content is, for me, this is just for me, it feels very singularly personal, but it deals with all these different ideas and things in the world. And so I don't know, man, that's like an ideal combo to me, from my mind.
I mean, I think that's a fair assessment. I've made this analogy before. I tend to, when I get questions, especially when I lecture, I'm lecturing to architecture students and faculty and people interested
Right.
in a very specific part of the discipline field.
Yeah.
I prefer not to use the word style.
Yeah.
I tend to use the word language.
Okay. Sure.
And
That's fair.
if I remove it out of the discipline,
Yeah.
I use the word sound. If I'm a band, I've defined my sound, and
Sure.
I'm not conscious that I'm trying to produce a sound. It's just
Right.
the aggregation of everything that I've worked on and abandoned and tried to relearn and things like that. So it's
Yeah.
just it's not a conscious effort.
Right. But that's why I think it's so good, because it just seems authentically who you are. And to me, well, I hate to use the word the best art because it sounds kind of elitist, but I'll use it. I mean, I think the best art really, I guess I'll put it this way. When I'm looking, let's say, at a Van Gogh in the museum, I mean, you would know a Van Gogh a mile away if you saw it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
but he didn't plan that. And it's the idea of somebody strategically coming up with a style or a look gets in the way often of the other stuff. And when somebody's authentic, I just think you get a straight beeline into their vision. It happens so quickly that it's faster than conscious thought, which is, why it hits you that way. It's visceral, and your work is really quite visceral and theoretical. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Maybe I didn't. Sorry, I couldn't come up with that intelligently until just now. But it's a very unique combination, because a lot of times for me, when I see visceral work, it's often extremely messy or gestural, and that's not a knock on it, right? Or
Sure.
work that's very theoretical. I mean, listen, I love Lawrence Weiner. He's one of my favorite artists, but you don't get any warm fuzzies from that guy.
Right.
Not that you should, right? And I don't think you get warm fuzzies from you, but your work is rich and dense. It kind of reminds me of Julie Moretu. I don't know if you know her work.
Oh, absolutely. God,
Yeah,
I wasn't even mentioned in the same sentence as her. Yeah, yeah.
she's amazing. But
Beyond, yeah.
I think that you two actually, aside from really different content, have some real interesting overlaps in the quality that your work, it's the visceralness and the feeling that there's a detachment. And I think it's a really winning combo, Bryan, for me, because I think your work, like when you had your show at SciArc, right? And the show at Woodbury, both. I remember thinking, wow, people who aren't architects could really and do really get into it, because let's face it, even people who know about architecture are not as steeped in theory as you are. We're kids from the 90s, man, 80s and 90s. I mean, I know theory is probably
Yep.
still big in architecture, but I think there's a real backlash in the art world, not backlash, but a kind of move toward more emotional kind of sincerity. And I think your work will hold up even under that new lens. Personally, I really believe that.
You're hired, man. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
No, I mean, yeah. I mean, there's no question. Again, we're both of that same age and that same school of thought. I completely agree with you. It's interesting. I was thinking too about the quest for the quest for style and sort of stumbling over that. I remember when I was younger, just getting into architecture in my undergraduate school, and then at the cusp of graduate school, thinking that one had to have a pronounced language style probably at that point.
Yeah.
And I didn't have that, and that was a huge hurdle, to be honest with you. I mean, it got in the way of any sincere investigations or productions, because there was a synthetic filter that I felt like I had to cram everything through.
Right.
And then, as life often works, I abandoned this searching for that.
Yeah.
And I suppose it has evolved over time as I guess it's intuitive. Intuition. Yeah. I prefer to think of it as maybe an informed or educated intuition, because of things that I've looked at and studied and then have affected me. And I've taken a moment and stepped back and tried to figure out why certain things resonate with me and why they don't. And then, and if I can sort of plug that back into the language. So it's more of an informed
Yeah.
intuition than not. So I think I went off on a tangent there, but
No,
that we were
that's
talking about that, and that kind of reminded me that that became a huge, not a hurdle, a wall, a
yeah,
box that I put myself in for such a long time, thinking that, looking at my peers and people that were maybe a half a generation older, that they had developed that language,
yeah.
and I was desperately floundering for it. And I get a lot of questions about that from
Hmm.
students now, and unfortunately I don't have an answer. I think it's one of those things that you just have to, you put your 10,000 hours in, and then you put another 30,000 on top of that, and
Yeah. Well,
it's what's discovered.
it's actually interesting. I mean, I don't have an answer, but I actually have an anecdote of my own that relates to what you're saying. When I got my MFA in 1990, and moved back to my hometown, of Des Moines, I did an exhibition at Drake University where I had been an undergraduate, and they were really not, my dad had just passed away, so I was kind of a mess, and they, I think out of charity, said, "Hey, you want to do a show just to kind of distract me?" But so I showed my grad work and my recent work right post grad, which was typically pretty, mediocre and searching for something, and basically my version of what you just said, right? I don't know who I am. And I remember I had put the show up, and my former teachers really were not into it. But my teacher, who I studied with for years, was extremely generous in terms of giving criticism. And he sat me down in the show one time, toward the end of it, and he said something that I still remember that I would tell students, and I might tell you, and I try to tell myself. He said, whether you think this work is strong or not, and whether I think it's strong or not, is really not to the point. And he said, there's probably a couple of passages in a couple of these pieces that are truly who you are authentically. And he
Mm.
said, you just need to give yourself time to figure that out, because there's too many voices in your head right now to kind of sort that out, number one. And he said, number two, that's the thing that's going to allow you to make good work. And don't feel bad that you're not there yet, because you do have to do what you just said, the 1,000 hours or the 30 years or whatever. And I mean, it really was permission to just flounder. And I desperately needed it at that point, because I was feeling like my own version of, I need to figure who the hell am I? And if I don't know who I am after I just got my fucking master's degree, I'm in serious trouble.
Yeah,
But as I tell people,
exactly.
I feel like I was in grad school for 10 years after grad school. Seriously.
It's so appropriate that you say that. I remember about 3 weeks after I graduated from UCLA in 1990, or maybe it was a week after.
Were you 1990?
1990.
We're the
Yeah,
same year, dude.
yeah, yeah,
All
yeah.
right.
Um, I remember finding my way back up into the architecture studio, because we worked in the studio,
Right.
feeling lost.
Yeah.
And there were 6, 7 of my recent graduate colleagues that were up there doing the same thing. We sort of didn't physically
Yeah.
and conceptually know where to go.
Right.
And I've often made the analogy that when I finished undergrad, I thought I had the answers to the questions, and I wanted to go to grad school to play around with it. And what
Me
grad
too.
school taught me is that I didn't know the answers.
Yeah.
And this sounds too cliche, but it taught me how to search for the right questions.
I mean, that's
And
not a cliche. I mean,
I would have not done that had I not gone through that experience. I think
oh,
it's the antithesis of Neo learning kung fu in the Matrix, where I know kung fu, right? There's
yeah.
no time that's been put in. There's
Right.
no failure. There's no friction. There's no dialogue. There's no chance for growth. And I mean, I appreciate, it's one of my favorite film of all time, but
Yeah.
it's the antithesis of that experience, that growth quality that you just kind of need to get in there and mix it up for a while, and
I
kind of
mean, you
figure it
got to
out.
fall on your face. I love art history, not because I love facts, but I really like the stories of when people answer real questions. The painter William de Kooning, I'm sure you're familiar with his, yeah. I guess, he got huge in the late 50s. I mean, he was a super icon of abstract expressionism, and rightly so. He's one of the best painters I've ever seen, for sure. But somebody asked him, he said, "Hey, Bill, it looks like all the kids are painting your paintings. They're painting them better than you do." And he goes, "Yeah, the problem with them, Al, is they can't do the shitty ones.
Oh, that's great. I haven't heard that.
And I don't know if he said shitty, but maybe he said bad. But I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
that's really what we're talking about, right? I mean,
that's
because
it,
you
man.
don't really find the edge that you need to find unless you cross it. I mean, at least I find, for me, I wish I could just wake up and download a matrix like, you know, how to paint and glaze in 5 steps. But
Right.
I also remember my painting teacher when I was a senior coming into class one day right before class. And you know, he was a great guy, but he really was out of sorts, you know. And I was like, dude, what's wrong with me, man? You don't look like you're having a good day. And he then looked at me because he was lost in his thoughts, and he said, man, you'd fucking think that after 40 years of painting, I could paint a fucking book correctly. And so I guess he was working on like a still life with a pile of books, and he said
Right.
he scraped it out and repainted it like 50 times because he just couldn't fucking get it, you know. And I mean, those are just pedestrian stories, but that's the workaday reality of our life, right? I mean, I'm sure you go through that. I mean, whenever I come into your studio, I mean, you always have beautiful looking things, but you're always like, man, this one's not going well. I mean, it's just how it
Oh,
is, right?
no one sees the hours and the layers of processing and self-editing, right? I
Right.
mean, it's interesting with the way that I do drawing. It's chronological based, right? I mean, I physically have to draw line one before I draw line two,
Yeah. Right.
but there's a tremendous amount of self-editing as the work evolves. This is the way that I explain it to architects.
Hmm.
Every time I set out to do a drawing, as an example, I'll start up with a set of parameters, a set of rules. You know, this is how
Okay.
things are going to behave. This is what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
These are the topics. This is what happens when X meets Y, whatever.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And then as the drawing develops, I allow for the development of a secondary set of organic rules to happen
Hmm.
that are, it's a result of relationships that I hadn't anticipated, which always happens, right?
Right.
I do speculative and experimental drawing, so I
Yeah.
do very little drawing where there is an expected outcome.
Right.
There's an expected dialogue and an expected set of issues that need to be battered around, but there's not a desired outcome. So that second set of rules allows for these emergent relationships and behaviors and conditions. It
Yeah.
allows for observational work, which observational has to happen at best live
Yeah.
as something is being drawn, but typically right after something is being drawn. So it goes back to chronology.
Yeah.
And then it also allows for some of those rules to become contradictory to
Yeah.
the initial rules. And then you have to get into this whole system of understanding which one is dominant, which one is passive, and why they're working together. And for me,
Hmm.
that's the exciting part. And that's
Yeah.
something that no one sees because it's internalized within the drawing and it's internalized within my head.
But I mean, I always say that if you do your job, it's thankless. You don't want people to be aware of that. You want them to be taken by your image. But it's interesting because what you're talking about translates exactly to painting and drawing to me in this sense. I mean, I'm working very photorealistically in lots of places now, and people think, and I always thought, because I wasn't trained that way particularly, that photorealism is like a mindless drone. You know, you look at it and you copy it. But you know what,
Right.
Bryan? It turns out that what you just said about, you know, plan A, number one, and then the improv, you know, you have to shift it. Even if you paint photorealistically, the marks and moves you make are never what you wanted originally. And I sometimes feel like I'm doing an abstract expressionist painting when I'm trying to get a transition from blue to blue green on the guy's sleeve or whatever.
Right. Right.
And you're right, man. Nobody fucking, like in my TV piece, I was painting those little TVs this big. That was still happening to me, where I'm like, oh, what I thought was going to be the right technique for this little piece, I'm doing something else. And it was, I mean, I felt like I was in like a John Coltrane improv, though you would hopefully never know that when you look
Right.
at the final piece. And so I think anybody who makes things would recognize the feeling of being, you know, like you dropped your oar in the water. Now you got to paddle with your hands, and you got to fucking get there somehow, because you're not. And there's no time to whining, man. There's no crying in baseball or whatever they
No,
say.
no, no. or
So
in
I mean,
basketball in my case, but yeah, no, there's no
what's
crying.
that?
Yeah, no crying in basketball in my
Basketball.
case.
Dude, I want to play basketball with you. I'm probably way worse than you are. I guarantee it. I'm terrible. I'm a scrappy defender, though.
That's what it all comes down to, man.
But I always foul out. That's the problem. So I do have another. I actually have a question. I was, I've been really psyched to talk to you for a while. I'm sorry it took so long to make it happen, but there's a couple of questions that, even though we've talked a lot about work with each other, that I've never actually asked you. And one of the things I realized when I was looking at all your work, thinking of what to post, and thinking about the couple shows I've seen, is that I realized that there's a really interesting sense through all the mechanical kind of marks and diagrammatic elements that are in your work. There's a real sense of an individual maybe lost in there, or there's something kind of, I want to say vulnerable, although it's a little cheesy, but I guess I'll just say it. And I think that's one of the things about your work that I find really emotional sometimes, that I'm surprised. It reminds me of the feeling, and this is going to sound really cheesy, but like when you realize that, the Terminator character has a human side, or it's that human side of technology, or, the whole thing in Blade Runner where do the replicants have feelings and are they human? There's something about your work that touches, and it's interesting that the Matrix, and I know you like that cross between technology and humanity. There's a real sense of there's a humanism in your work that I find interesting, because at first glance you might not expect it. And I've never asked you this, but I'm curious, A, if you are aware of that in your work, or if it's just on my side, and B, if it's something that you cultivate. So that's a double tough question.
That is a really challenging question.
You don't have to answer it if you don't want to.
There's a quote. God, any of the architects watching are gonna burn me on this if I get it wrong. I think it was from Frank Lloyd Wright.
Okay.
And he was talking about the machine, and
Uh-huh.
there was a passage that I read when I was in undergraduate school that stuck with me, that said something to the lines of, I'm paraphrasing here, it's about time that an artist got a hold of the switch, meaning the on-off switch for the
That's
machine.
a great quote, dude. I
That
gotta
always
write
kind
that
of
down.
stuck with me.
Hang
And
on.
I think it was Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm sure
Yeah.
I'll be corrected in a thousandfold by the
No,
scholars.
I'm sure we can look it up.
It's interesting. When I was growing up in North Carolina and around so many machines, and I've told the version of this anecdote a lot, so please forgive me if you've heard it before.
No, it's either way.
So I grew up in a farming and tobacco community, and there were several different kinds of machines that I interacted with. So where we lived, there was kind of a newer housing development, so there were all these machines for making roads and scraping off lots and digging basements and things like that.
Yeah.
And then there were the large farming machines, planters and seeders and spraying the protectants and things like that. Massive machine, and then harvesting machines.
Yeah.
And then my dad was a textile worker
I didn't know that.
Burlington Industries, and he used to take me into work with him. And there were machines that you could climb in. In fact, one of his jobs was to climb inside them. But all of the machines as a kid to me were the size of small houses or larger.
Right.
So they became, and they all interacted with the human at a kinetic level.
Yeah.
Where the human was controlling them, but at some point they were controlling the actions of the human.
Right.
There's another dialogue between Neo and the governor or the mayor about we need them and they need us kind of a thing.
Right.
But it impregnated on me early that, and not to go all matrixy on this, but the humans without the machines and the machines without the humans, none of them are as interesting.
That's right. Yeah.
And it is that it's that interaction that has always intrigued me. If you look at, and some can debate this, one of the base functions of architecture, it is to it is built for humans to inhabit, occupy, to enrich their lives. So there's a give and take.
Yeah.
The human without architecture and then the architecture without humans are different things. So there was all of this sort of pre-programming early on that the human aspect was not something that would have been devoid from.
Right.
It for me is interesting too why, although I do a lot of digital work, it's a little challenging for me to access it in the same way as the analog work.
Mm-hmm.
And the phrase that I had come up with is because of the interface equals interference.
Yeah.
You know, so I've got my eye, my mind, my hand, which is touching a mouse, which is connected to a cord, which is connected to a screen, which gives me an arrow that has parallax to the. I mean, there's so many levels of interference.
Yeah.
When I'm doing an analog, when I'm making a model or doing a drawing by hand, it's right there. I mean, you know, not to get too graphic about it, but like anything in reality, the act of actually doing something I find to be much more interesting and exciting than the act of studying that act.
Right. Of course,
or conceptualizing about it. It's important, but having the physicality, which I think goes back to the martial arts and the sports, you know, training, because it was the interaction of a human with an object, with another human, with a set of graphics that dictated the set and plays of rules. That all just kind of impregnated on me early. Is it scripted or is it thought of? Not consciously.
Right.
It was early on.
Yeah.
But I think it's just a way for me to map how I interpret and absorb the world. And when I'm trying to spit out something that might interact with somebody else occupying the world, it's a way of navigating. I prefer to leave it open-ended so that I'm not prescribing the way that I view it as the way that the observer or the reader or the occupant or the inhabitant, they don't have to read it the same way. That is a conscious effort. You know, what that means in application, I'm still trying to figure out.
But that, I mean, first of all, what I find interesting is that you have an extreme rigorous way of constructing your process, whether it's not saying it's scripted, but it is rigorous, Bryan. Come on. I mean, you got to admit that in a good way.
Sure.
But it's also I never thought of this term for you, not for you specifically, but I think you're a generous artist in the sense that you are not attempting to control your viewer. As much theory and process as informs your work, you're leaving a lot of open space for the viewer to participate in your work, which is why I think, and among other things, it's one of the reasons I think that it's so strong and that I think it's appealing to people who don't give a shit about architecture. No offense to anybody, but not everybody. I love architecture. I mean, that's one of the things we connected on early on. I'm a fan, not an expert, but I think that it seems to me that when I came to your talk at SciArc and was around SciArc helping you do that wall drawing, I was actually blown away by the fact that theory is alive in architectural practice. What I mean by that is that I know, and I'm sure I'll take some heat for this from some artists, but I think a lot of artists who work from a theoretical basis it's like taking a shower with a raincoat on. They are not feeling it. I think theory is art. Good theory is like poetry to me. You know, Roland Barthes or Walter Benjamin. I mean, you know, Baudrillard. They're incredible. The thing I find interesting is that I think architects who use theory make great things. I think there's something about the practice that maybe it's just so huge and encompassing that it becomes another piece of the pie. So I don't know. I'm kind of envious of that in a way. Although, anyway, I think that your ability to work in all those platforms it's pretty impressive, Bryan. I mean, I know you don't like compliments, so I don't want to overdo it. But so okay.
It's interesting.
Go ahead.
You've excuse me. You've used the word artist. It's quite interesting. This is a battle that I've fought over a couple of decades. Is that typically, and I'm going to get in trouble for
we're all getting in trouble for this, Bryan. Let's do it.
But
might as well do it.
My architecture friends and colleagues all accuse me or accuse my work of not being architecture but being art.
Right.
Ironically, the vast majority with you might be one of the only living exceptions of my artist colleagues and friends.
Right.
Accuse my work of not being art.
Right.
of being architecture. So I've involuntarily had to, and I resisted it first. And then I just thought, well, again, if I resist it, then I'm bowing down to the classification structure, which I'm not a fan of. So
Yeah.
it's an observation. So I mean, depending on which side of my face I'm talking on, I refer to as architecture. I might refer to it as art. I actually don't know if it's a credible example of either. I think it's maybe a hybrid, but and again, I took such a long wasted time of my youth trying to classify it,
Yeah.
and then at a certain point I just stopped giving a damn about it and just thought,
Right.
the work is the work. If person
Right.
X
Right.
wants to label it as one thing and person Y wants to label it as something else, God bless them.
Yeah.
It doesn't affect the nature of the work, and the work is about the search. It's
Yeah.
about the inquiry. It's about the mapping,
Yeah.
as we've talked about, and it is what it is. And
Right.
you can classify it as A or you can classify it as B, and I guess I should be just happy if you can classify it at all.
Well, I
But
mean, it's
you've used the
interesting that
word
you're talking about
artist.
this.
Go ahead.
I consider you an artist and an architect, and I guess my view of labels has changed. I think that I was really opposed to them for a long time, and I was kind of a snob about it. But it's interesting, one of my favorite. I really love music too. I love pop music and rock music, but I also love classical music because my parents are both classical musicians.
Right.
And one of my favorite figures is a pianist named Glenn Gould, who is pretty famous, who was a Canadian pianist who was very eccentric, an incredible player, but also extremely interested in breaking barriers. Anyway, he was even talking about, people who are like labeling this as a classical, as a contemporary. I mean, music has the same problems as architecture and art. Every discipline does, right? And he said, somebody said, written theory of architecture is a waste of time. We use designs to communicate the visions. I like that.
Well,
And we have some great
that's them.
people,
Yeah.
some really sharp people are watching this, Bryan. I'm not used to that. No, I'm kidding. Um, uh, what I was going to say is Glenn Gould said he understood the need for some audiences to label things, because different people experiencing things different ways. He didn't begrudge people needing to label things, though for himself he needed to remove the label. And so I think that's what you're saying, is that you understand that the world is going to consume your work. I think as
Sure.
artists, I think trying to control the reaction to one's work is a huge waste of time. I have found, and I have spent some time trying to. So I've been the fool myself plenty of times. That said, I think that understanding that there's a difference between your internal needs as an artist, architect, whatever, maker, and an external, the world consuming it, understanding that those are different seems to me, if you can accept that contradiction, and one of the things about therapy that I went through, and I don't want to talk about myself too much, but dialectical behavioral therapy, which is what really saved my life, is based on the idea of the dialectic, which is basically what it was explained to me in therapy, was that a dialectic is something in which two opposing viewpoints can both be true simultaneously without contradiction. Like if you move away, Bryan, let's say, and get like $1 million and go move to New Zealand or whatever, I'm happy for you and I'm sad I won't get to see you. And those two
Sure.
things coexist. I mean, that was a stupid, cheesy example, but so the dialectic actually allows us, in my opinion, to deal with multiple forces on us as creators, right? And to internalize them and let them exist almost like parallel roads that may never meet. And I think that's kind of a beautiful way of letting the artist creator off the hook to just do what they need to do for their work and still be generous to the audience to allow them to consume the work the way they need to. You know what I mean? And I feel like you have figured that out, for sure, in your own way.
I mean, I think I truly appreciate that, and I understand it internally. I don't know if it's reflected in the work, although I did get
I
a
think it is. I'm saying well, sorry, go ahead.
that's when you said that about the two parallel roads that never, or paths that never converge. I got a vision of a drawing
All right.
that is looking at I mean, actually, I think that's one of the beauty. And when I say drawing, this is where I think, yeah, what I produce is more architectural than artistic. In fact,
Okay.
when we did the SciArc show, and
Yeah.
we had that one section of all the drawings on the walls.
Yeah.
It was interesting. It may have been your class.
Yeah, I
Who
brought my
brought
class.
up,
Yeah.
and several of the grad students made the comments, "Well, this isn't art. It's too cold. It's heartless," which I
I
find
remember
interesting.
that.
And yeah, but it's interesting that so when I think of a drawing in the non-artistic but the architectural, which is maybe more of a mapping, it allows for the condition of those two paths or those two conditions that don't converge in reality, that you can show that simultaneously in a drawing where they're not converging, but then you can start looking at their overlapped relationships
Yeah.
that you can't do in any other medium. I mean, you could probably do it digitally in VR, but I'm not versed in that. But the nice thing about a drawing is that my tagline, and it's going to be the subtitle of the second book, is that drawings lie.
Drawings
And then
lie.
the subtitle
Yeah.
is they tell you the untruths that you want to hear. You
True.
can get away with a lot. That's the wrong way of saying it, but
Yeah.
you can show a lot of, and this is what I'm really interested in my drawing experiments, is that you can look and you can explore and examine relationships that don't have another way of showing themselves in reality, or in three-dimensional form,
Yeah.
three-dimensional static form.
Yeah.
Even though the drawings I make are static,
Yeah.
in my mind, they're mappings of movements. They're not static. They're kinetic. They're constantly moving, and that's where a lot of the dotted line comes from, that talked about trajectories and things like that and interactions. So I don't think of them as static components. I think of them as these highly interactive components, and I feel that, at least as in my limited world, the speculative or experimental drawing is the only true way to investigate those kinds of scenarios, relationships, conditions, whatever you want to call them.
Well, first of all, I think that your work feels that way. It feels like it is your language. It's like you're like an explorer in a way, in a really cool way. But so I have to take it. I'm not taking issue with what you said, but I don't agree that your drawings are not art because they're cold. And I'm not saying the person who said that is wrong either, because everybody sees things the way they see them.
Sure, yeah.
But here's my take on it, is that your drawings have an obsessive human quality that gives them a warmth. The care that you take to make those marks is content. Process can be content. You know, I realized that from listening to John Cage talk about his work, where he talks about the fact that he's making processes, not objects, in a traditional classical musical sense. True. But his work is not cold at all. It has the warmth of somebody who took the time to collect. And, you know, Walter Benjamin wrote an amazing essay on the collector, you know, and he was a great figure for me, because as a theorist, he bridges the 19th and 20th centuries in this really funky way. You know, the warmth of the romantics with the new kind of detachment of, you know, the post-war theory that he anticipated, actually, and interestingly. So,
right.
So I just don't, and I mean, the other thing I wanted to say was that, you know, there's a really great story that Robert Rauschenberg tells about Duchamp, you know, and, you know, Marcel Duchamp was the classic cold, you know, he tried to be the cold European detached guy, and you know, super like smart ass and, you know, aloof. And a lot of his work is seen, even by him, as being a kind of negative comment. You know, like, I can take a urinal and fuck you, it's a piece of art. Or I can not work and go underground for 40 years and pretend to not be an artist. You know, and Robert Rauschenberg said that there's a famous piece that's a bicycle wheel stuck into a stool, right? It's a sculpture by Duchamp, a ready-made. And at the time, particularly, everybody was talking about how it's an anti-art gesture, right? That whole thing that we've heard about. And Rauschenberg, who was the younger generation, said, this is when he was in his 30s or 20s, he said that when he saw the bicycle wheel sculpture, he didn't really understand what everybody was talking about. He thought it was just a really beautiful piece of sculpture that was made just for him. That's how and despite the fact that he knew Duchamp, actually.
Right, right.
And he knew, probably had heard him talk about it. And his point was, I don't give a fuck whether you think that you're making an anti-art gesture. For me, it's a beautiful traditional. He said he saw it just like a Michelangelo, which I thought was a ballsy thing and sincere thing to say.
Sure.
And so I'm sorry I'm being a little bit long-winded here, but that's how I see your work in a way, is that I'm sure we have a lot of architects who are listening now, and I understand. I don't know if your work is art or architecture or in between, but I do know that I could, if you had the right curator, I could take any one of your drawings and put it in a drawing show, and nobody would give you a hard time. I'm telling you, in a particular context, you
Right.
know, the idea that art has to be heart on your sleeve confessional, which is really, if you think about it, I mean, I am a student of art history. I will tell you this, that this romantic idea that the artist bears their soul and you know, flays themselves alive in front of you can be touching and inviting. But if you look at the big history of art, I mean, I defy you to show me an ancient Egyptian piece that looks emotional that way. It's basically a diagrammatic comic book, which makes your work look like abstract expressionism, Bryan. So, I mean, it's all contextual, right? And
Sure, sure.
I just don't, I think you probably heard this all your life, and you're probably a little battered by it, and you've had to construct ways of dealing with these kind of direct criticisms, which I understand, but I just don't think there's that much truth to a lot of it in the end from a longer perspective. I think your work fits into a very long tradition of drawing. And I mean, do you know Sol LeWitt? Do you know the minimalist?
Yep, yep.
I mean, his wall drawings, he doesn't even make. He just writes diagrams for them, directions, and people make them in the museum. I guarantee you, Bryan, if you put your work up in an exhibition with Sol LeWitt, your work would look warm and fuzzy.
That's why I like hanging out with you, man. Again, my knowledge of the art discipline and certainly of art history is, it's you can't even measure it. There's no metric for it.
There's no reason you need to know that, Bryan. And I would say the same thing about my knowledge of architecture is extremely limited. I mean, I bet
you know more about architecture than I know about art.
I don't think that's true. I mean, we studied it. I love it, but I'm not conversed with a lot of theory. You know, I mean, I love driving around, and I do look at architecture. I look at it as art, though. I look at it as things made by humans that are also utilitarian. And in some ways, I think architecture is far more. I don't want to say it's better, but I think as an art form that affects people, it's far superior to art right now in terms of globally. I mean, we have to live in structures, and I mean, I am deeply affected by architecture in ways I don't even know every day, you know. So, I mean, it's not a competition. It's not like mine's bigger than yours kind of thing, hopefully. Yeah. But I think that recognizing, you know, art had to go underground. When the photograph was invented, painting had a crisis of identity that it has never recovered from. I don't know how painting could ever be the language of the culture the way it used to be. I just don't think it's possible, and I think digital stuff has replaced that, you know. And I don't know. So I don't want to change gears, but I do want to ask you. We have like 10 minutes left. Someone says, if it wasn't for architecture, I wouldn't be an artist. There you go.
There you go.
See, one of the things, so I'll say one more thing. Part of the problem with being trained as a painter is that painters often are like high priests who think that painting is the true faith. That's fucking bullshit, by the way. But I love painting. I mean, it's one of my languages, but you know, some languages are more useful than others.
Sure.
I mean, painting is like Latin, and architecture is like, you know, contemporary English. That's how I see it.
Well, and again, I'll get burned if I get too far into this from the architects, but for the artists that might be watching, there's a in my world, there's a difference between architecture and building.
Okay, that's fair.
That's a 9-hour conversation.
Yeah, well, dude, let's do another one of these. You can give me a master class on architectural theory. Okay. We'll do it live. So yeah. So I just want to shift gears for 2 minutes here.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that this has been a great opportunity to talk about your work, and I'm glad that we've been able to do that. But I have to say that I think you're also one of the best teachers that I know, and I really mean that
Wow.
sincerely. And so it's just to make it not about my opinion, and we've talked about this, but I am going to share Carly's observation if you don't mind, and it's going to embarrass you, so get ready.
Sure.
So Carly Fernandez, I don't know if anybody who's watching knows Carly. Is
Amazing
one
artist.
She's one of the best artists in LA. She's an amazing artist and an amazing person, but just a really wonderful artist and multidisciplinary artist, performance, object making, drawing. She does it all extremely
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And so the first time I actually ever met her was back, I think, in 2006 or 7 or something, at a party given by Chris and Blair Acuna Hansen, who ran Acuna Hansen Gallery, and both Carly and I used to show there. But I hadn't met her yet, so we were just at a nice casual party at their house. And she's like, "Oh, you teach at Fullerton, you know?" And I was like, "Yeah, yeah." And we were talking. And she goes, "Yeah, you must know Bryan Cantley." I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, he's a friend of mine, and he's a great artist." And she goes, "Listen, I got to tell you, I took his 3D design class, and I don't remember what year it was. You might not remember. A while ago.
A long time ago.
Yeah, Carly said, and this is not hyperbole, man. This is serious. She said, "Yeah, he's like the best teacher I ever studied with. I learned more about being an artist in his 3D design class. 3D design, Art 104. She said I learned more about me and an artist in that class than the rest of undergraduate and grad school combined. And she went to a good grad school. I don't know even where she went. And she wasn't saying that her grad experiences were shit, but your, rigorous parameter setting, building, problem solving, she said it really set her up for success. And I know we've talked about how you run your class and your projects, but, setting up conditions kind of sounds like the way you do your work. And I've talked to other students at Fullerton who have said I know you're known as a demanding teacher, to put it kindly.
Yeah.
I think you're a great teacher, but I did not solicit that comment from her. I mean, that came out sincerely, and so I think that's a real thing that's worth noting. So
It's beyond humbling.
I knew you were going to say that.
Well, it's hard to almost not get emotional about that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's unearned praise from anybody, but especially from somebody like Carly, who's just a force.
Yeah, but Bryan, I know so many students at Fullerton who are some of the best art students that I've been there for 17 years now. So I actually have some authority to say this. There are a lot of some of the best students who have had you who feel similarly. I mean, I know that if you're a demanding teacher, sometimes to put this diplomatically, you don't always get the love of the crowd.
That's a good
You know what
way
I
of putting
mean?
it.
You're not Russell Crowe in Gladiator, but
Right.
but you might be one of those guys who the real serious people really appreciate, and I think that's a mark of something worth noting.
Well, that's incredibly. I don't even have the words. Thank you for embarrassing me, but for
sorry, man. I'll buy you a
no,
beer for that one.
and I think coming from a teacher of the year, that means quite a lot. An
what?
accolade, and a teacher of the year.
I never was teacher of the year.
You were teacher of the year, yeah.
I don't remember that.
I think you were. Anyway,
oh, that's right.
You're reveled there as one of the gurus, rightly so.
Oh, come on, man.
Not that I
all
want to
they
get
gave me
into
was they gave me a Cal State Fullerton Titans tie, which I think I might use in my next performance piece. Maybe I'll cut it in half.
I didn't get a tie. I got a little plastic pyramid for my 20 years with a little globe on top of it. I was telling somebody this morning, it's like, man, just pay for my parking one semester. That's a far more honorific token than I'm coming up on 30. I can only imagine what I'm gonna get this time around. It'll
Maybe
be
I'll give you a
home COVID test with the Cal State Fullerton logo.
I want them to give me a Tuffy the Titan rubber mask so I can wear for Halloween.
that'd be great.
Or at least faculty meetings. That way I won't get in trouble because I'll be anonymous.
Well, one thing you said about the students, though, at the end of the day, I think all of those students, like Carly was going to be great no matter who taught her. So,
but Bryan, you didn't know that. And when you met her, I mean, you didn't know
No.
that when you started teaching. I mean, my point is that you leave an opening for those people to really get something that is for them life changing, man. I mean, I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think that you're one of the people that really lit the way for her to do what she does so well. I mean, I know you're not going to take, dude. I would have to like, you know, get you unconscious to actually not get a reaction like this. So I'm not expecting any assignation from you, but anyway. But I know what you're saying. Listen, I mean, I think I mean, we could have a whole maybe we should have a whole podcast about teaching, which could be interesting, actually.
Actually, I think it would be. Although we might get fired if we have
no, dude, we will. Well, I tell you what, man. I will draft up we will not say any. We will keep it all positive because we both have lots of positive things to say about teaching.
Sure. Yeah.
We don't have to talk about the institution. We can talk about teaching, which to me are the same thing as what you say about architecture and building.
Absolutely.
Or different.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that I would happy to be involved.
All right, well, let's do it, man. I mean, I think a lot of, I mean, this has been one of the, we're almost out of time here, but this has been one of the most interesting discussions for me personally. I don't know how other people feel, but I mean, I knew it would be. And, you know, I wanted to leave a couple of minutes. We have a lot of people watching right now. Do you mind if we open up a couple of room for questions, Bryan? Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah. Whatever you want.
If anybody has a question, you can drop it in the chat if you like. Bryan is inspired. Yeah, I mean, you're going to get a lot of compliments probably. Well, if anybody has a question for Bryan in the last 4 minutes, he'd be happy to take one. I'll wait and see if anybody comes up with one.
If not, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce his name right. Hazem. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. That is the guy to watch.
You cut out a second. Say it again.
Hazem.
Oh yeah,
he is the guy to watch.
Okay.
So, everybody should, that you should keep an eye on what he's doing.
I'm going to keep an eye. I'm going to do it, man.
Remarkably talented architect, graphic designer, artist. Yeah, nice. Yeah. He's actually another multidisciplinary. He's kind of pulling from several different disciplines in ways that you wouldn't normally think, and making these most incredible concoctions. So he's definitely something to keep your eye on for sure.
All right. Well, shout out to Hazem then. I'll look forward to following his work too. All right, Bryan. Well, listen, thank you so much. We're going to get cut off in 2 minutes by Instagram.
Oh,
so
okay.
I'd rather end it. He said, oh, yeah. Somebody was asking about that we should collaborate. We are planning on collaborating on something. We just haven't. This has been a kind of a crazy year. But now that I'm back, you know, and not sitting in my depressed couch watching 25 hours of YouTube a day, we have a collaboration that we're cooking up, and I don't want to say too much more about it actually until we actually do something. But maybe we should kick 2022 off and start working on that once we get back to school.
Idea. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Bryan, thank you so much, man. I would love to do a second round in the next month if you're down.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. All right, everybody.
I'll see you in a week or so.
Yes, we will sit in the hallowed halls. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in.
Peace, everybody. Thank you.
We'll see you next time. Hazem, I'm gonna follow you, and praise from Bryan holds a lot of weight from me. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you on the next time. Bryan, peace, man.
Take care, guys.
Take care.